Hello, everyone. Welcome to the annual Sussex International Theory Symposium. My name is Melanie Richter-Montpetit, and I'm the director of the Center for Advanced International Theory, short CAIT, here at the University of Sussex. The core mission of our center is to support innovative, fundamental research on international politics, free of the requirement for direct policy relevance. Our home discipline of international relations, of course, is known for its rather keen desire to influence policymaking, and typically from the perspective of the strong in the international system. CAIT provides a space to step back and be reflexive about the concepts and theories we draw on, and the larger epistemological and ontological foundations of our research. This kind of work provides important intellectual support for innovative, empirical scholarship and political action. Every year, the Sussex International Theory Symposium is devoted to a piece of cutting-edge scholarship that offers exactly that kind of innovative, fundamental research. Typically, when we think of what constitutes the cutting edge of contemporary scholarship, we tend to think of work from maybe the last 1 or 2 years. This year's symposium is dedicated to a book that was published 25 years ago, Siba Grovogui's Sovereigns, Quasi-Sovereigns and Africans, Race in Self-Determination and International Law, published by University of Minnesota Press. This is a book that is part of a rich scholarly inheritance, to use Robbie Shilliam's language in his interview, of 15 IR scholars of race and racism, recently published in International Politics Review. That is to say, the book is squarely situated in a long trajectory of insurrectionary thought. Simultaneously, it's a book that is precisely on the cutting edge as the discipline fitfully reinvigorates its efforts to more seriously grapple with how IR was founded in the service of reinforcing empire and the global color line, and how racism and white supremacy continue to permeate and shape core IR theories, concepts, and practices. This symposium is intended to open up space to think about what it means, both intellectually and politically, to revisit sovereigns, quasi-sovereigns, and Africans a quarter century after it was written, and find that it's not only a classic text, but that it is continuing to create and find intellectual contexts, only growing in relevance as indeed part of the cutting edge of IR. We are absolutely, massively delighted to celebrate today the 25th anniversary of the publication of Siba's book, Sovereigns, Quasi-Sovereigns, and Africans. We're joined by 6 invited speakers who will be in conversation with the author. I would like to thank the panelists and Siba for being here with us today. My special thank you goes to Sophie Herford for all the logistical work in getting us together this afternoon. I'm now going to introduce Professor Grovogui. Siba Nseatula Grovogui is Professor of International Relations and Political and Legal Thought at Cornell University in the United States. He's also visiting Nelson Mandela Professor in the Department of Political and International Studies at the University of Rhodes, South Africa, for the years 2020 and 2021. Siba Grovogui is originally from Guinea, where he lived and studied. After studying law there, he was an intern in 1979 before going to the Bouquet Court of Appeal in 1980 as an assistant judge. He was then legal advisor to the National Commission for Agreements, Protocols, and Contracts at the Ministry of Economic and Financial Affairs. Grovogui obtained a doctorate in political science with a minor in international law from the University of Wisconsin at Madison in 1988. He held teaching positions at the University of Michigan on the Du Bois Mandela Rodney Postdoctoral Fellowship. He taught at the University of Eastern Michigan in the early 90s, the University of Johns Hopkins until 2013 before joining Cornell University. Professor Grovogui teaches in the fields of international relations, international law, and political theory. He joined Cornell University to teach in the field of African political thought. Professor Grovogui continues to sit on the editorial or advisory boards of the main journal series of books and professional organizations. He's the author of Sovereigns, Quasi-Sovereigns and Africans, Race and Self-Determination in International Law, and Beyond Eurocentrism and Anarchy, Memories of International Order and Institutions. He's currently completing 2 conjoint manuscripts. The first book is titled The Gaze of Copernicus, Postcolonialism, Serendipity, and the Making of the World. And the second book is titled No Partial Public Sympathies, African Traditions of Humanism, from Quilombo to the Anti-Apartheid Movement. Now, before we turn to the panel, a few short words of housekeeping. Please note that this event will be recorded and published online, including on our center's YouTube channel. Our panelists will speak for around an hour, and then we will open up the conversation for questions and comments from the audience. If you tweet about this event, kindly use the hashtag Sussex Int Theory Simp 2021. I'm going to post it in the chat box in a moment. And there is captioning for this event available. Now, it is with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce our first invited speaker, Professor Antony Anghie. Tony Anghie is Professor of Law at the National University of Singapore and at the University of Utah. His research interests include international economic law, the use of force, globalization, and the history and theory of international law. He's a member of the TWAIL network of scholars, and he is joining us from Singapore tonight, where it's around midnight. So we are very, very grateful to have him with us tonight. Tony, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Melanie. And let me begin by thanking you for inviting me on this occasion. I didn't know very much about your center, but I'm really impressed by the ambitions of the center to, you could say, disconnect yourself from policy advice. And so we can actually focus on the larger and more important issues that underline so many of the features of the international system. I was going to apologize preemptively. It is a bit past midnight in Singapore, and I find, having done this on a few previous occasions, that I start fading out and become less and less coherent as the event progresses. It seems that somehow, you know, are these Zoom meetings Eurocentric, I wonder? Is it Greenwich Mean Time that still dictates, you know, how all this actually operates? I'm not quite sure. But so apologies for my, you could say, I find that I can't always maintain my line of thought as the events progress into the small hours of the morning. But I'm especially delighted to be here because I think it is so important to celebrate a really remarkable and prophetic book. And in the few minutes that I have available to me, I just wanted to make a few comments about this. So the first thing about Siba's wonderful book is just what a powerful and enduring analysis it is as to why self-determination didn't really deliver on the promise of self-determination and sovereignty. And it is a very wide-ranging analysis which incorporates philosophy, theology, law, and policy. And we talk about political science as having some kind of predictive value. And I'm not sure whether Siba would subscribe to that particular model of political science. But in terms of a predictive value, I think it is a very important book because the paradigm that he suggests as to why developing countries, the new states continue to face problems, continues to me to be a very compelling analysis. The second thing I wanted to say is that we should remember the time at which Siba wrote this book, which is 1996, because it was a time, as far as I'm concerned, I feel more familiar with the field of international law than of international relations. But the whole vocabulary, the whole critique that imperialism provided had entirely disappeared from, you could say, the vocabulary of scholarship at that time. So in the 1990s, this was a time when neoliberalism, globalization, the liberal worldview had become really very dominant. And of course, Francis Fukuyama's book suggests this. And so it was, we all know that Siba is a very, you could say, distinctive and individual person. And that is reflected in his book, the fact that it is written at this point of time. So I think it is especially important as a contribution, given the time in which it was written. The further point that I think is noteworthy now is the whole insistence, Siba's insistence on race as a fundamental category of analysis. And it's there in the subtitle. And I can't help thinking about, again, how prophetic this is. If we think about some of the recent debates, at least in the world of international law, some of you might be aware of the work, the wonderful work of the special rapporteur on the whole question of race and the enduring effects of racism, Professor Tendai Achiumi, who has produced a very important report in the UN about the whole question of race, the enduring character of race, and the whole issue of reparations. Again, when we think about the enduring character of race and how it persists and how it has pervaded our thinking in so many different ways, again, I think it's hard to go past Siba's analysis of how race has pervaded the entire structure of Western thinking about non-Western peoples. And by the way, I should also point out that I don't think this is entirely, we shouldn't confine this to Western and non-Western, because I think there are many unfortunate manifestations of racism in various other contexts as well. But again, Siba provides us with a model about how we can think about these issues. I would point to Tendai Achiumi's report. If I had the competence, I would actually post that report somewhere on the chat function so everyone can have a look at it and connect that with Siba's work. I suppose the final point is I sort of flit in and out of international relations. And one thing that interests me is just how oblivious international relations has been to the issue of race. I think very noble efforts were made to bring post-colonialism to international relations. This seems to me such an obvious thing to do, but it does not appear to have really taken place, at least at the time that I was more engaged with international relations. There were wonderful efforts made by, for example, Philip Darby at Melbourne, trying to introduce post-colonialism to international relations. And I do know of Branman Griffith Jones's efforts, Sankaran Krishna. But I'm just interested in the whole question about how, where is international relations now in relation to this whole question of race? And how does the mainstream respond to all these issues at a time when it seems obvious that the type of analysis that Siba has been doing all these years is really continues to be such a powerful way of illuminating the present state of the world. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Leonel Zevonu. Leonel Zevonu is an associate professor of public law at the University of Paris-Nanterre. He teaches European administrative law, economic law, administrative law, and public administration. Since 2018, he has been appointed for 5 years to the Institut Universitaire de France. Professor Zevounou is now working on the relationship between race and law, particularly the tensions generated by the universalist claim of French law and colonial domination through the category of assimilation. Lionel, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Siba, to invite me. I must begin by saying that I'm not a specialist in international law or international relation. Rather, as Melanie just says, my areas of research concern legal theory, EU economic law, and more recently, the relationship between law and race. I searched for Siba Grovogui work in French libraries, especially the large Cujas library specialized in the legal field of Panthéon-Sorbonne and Panthéon-Assas universities, and I found nothing. Let me put it bluntly. In general, there is still no space within the French-speaking legal academic doctrine devoted to trail and critical approaches to international law. We could discuss the causes of this situation for a long time, but I do not have the time to do so today. To give you a short idea of the situation, I will say this. As an associate professor tenured, I do not have up to now a seminary assigned in my own university on the topic of relationship between law and race. So Siba thesis is very important for me because it deserves to be explored further. A quick research lead to this. First, in my point of view, an intellectual analysis of the third worldists, what we were called in France, approche tiers-mondiste, movement initiated after the independence in the Francophone space is still lacking. I'm thinking here of people like Mohamed Bejawi or Ahmed Mayou, and my hypothesis is the following. The third worldist movement in France has been fought from an academic point of view. It is important to know that until now, the appointment of the university professors in Francophone-speaking areas has always included a professor from the former metropolis. This system which results from the cultural agreement signed in 1961 in Conseil africain et malgache d'enseignement supérieur, CAMES, has prevented the emergence of any critical thinking since independence. Second, while searching, I found a thesis on the decolonization of Namibia. Anyhow, I found it. And this thesis was written by Jacques Bobo. Born in 1938, Jacques Roger Bobo was Minister of External Relations in Cameroon. He did his thesis under the supervision of Pierre-François Gonidec, and Pierre-François Gonidec is one of the first white academics to have taken under his direction several Black PhD students in law before the independence. These PhD students, once in Africa, will reproduce the metropolitan system of assimilation in the recruitment of university professors. Like many French-speaking elites after independence, Jacques Bobo was Minister of External Relations in Cameroon. He worked closely with the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Yet, Bobo's careers would undergo a brutal change in the mid of on the 19th. His name is mentioned in the complicity of UN forces in Rwanda genocide. This little story shows that it is high time, I think, in my point of view, to look more closely at the trajectory of French-speaking African jurists after independence and the constraints they faced during their careers. And in Siba thesis is, from this point of view, only a beginning in French-speaking countries. It still has many good days ahead of it, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lionel. Our next speaker is Freya Irani. Sorry, am I still muted? I'm frozen. Either frozen or muted. It's always one of the two. Okay. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Freya Irani. Freya Irani is an assistant professor at Arcadia University. Her work examines struggles over jurisdiction in global politics. In particular, she is interested in the ways in which US legal authority is both constituted and contested within and outside the territory that the US government claims as its own. Her work places US legal developments in transnational perspective, drawing together the legal dynamics of US settler colonialism and overseas empire. Professor Irani has been a Mellon Sawyer Research Fellow at the University of Minnesota, a postdoctoral researcher at Columbia Law School, and a visiting assistant professor at Vassar College. Freya, over to you.
Great, thanks, Melanie. And thank you for inviting me to join this conversation and bringing us all together to celebrate this book. I first encountered this book as a first-year PhD student, and so that's kind of how I came to it. And in some ways, the perspective I still come to it through. And I think it's been significant to me, just both in kind of shaping a general orientation to the study of international law in IR, and also because of the more specific histories of sovereignty that the book traces so well. So I really appreciated kind of the chance that this symposium has given me to go back and really think through the debt that I owe this book. And I think so many of us owe this book, I think both directly through our readings of it, but also through, I think, our readings of the other works that this book has opened up a road for. So the aspect of the book that I think has been most significant for my own thinking is its identification of this key and recurrent dynamic in IR, where the political authority of colonized people has been repeatedly kind of curtailed or limited at the very moment at which, and through the very mechanisms by which, this authority is often understood as coming into being in the first place. And this curtailment takes place partly, but of course not only, through the meanings that have been given to sovereignty and self-determination in and through European legal practice. And one of the things that the book insists on here that I think is really important is that this practice needs to be understood to include kind of the violent enforcement of particular interpretations of law. The book shows us that for colonized people, sovereignty and self-determination have been narrowly construed to mean the authority to contract away, to alienate one's land, one's labor, one's political authority. To not contract away, to not surrender or dispose the self to Europe, or even to conceptualize that self differently, have not been sort of options that are available within the context of European international law. So Professor Grovogui's identification of this key dynamic, I think, has opened up a space for so much thinking, not only on sovereignty, I think, but in recent years also thinking on property and dispossession. But what I want to do is talk just super quickly about how these insights have been formative for my own thinking on US practices of extraterritorial jurisdiction in the post-war period. So a context very different than the context that's specifically looked at in the book. So just to give you a very sort of unnuanced summary of these practices, since 1945, US judges have extended particular kinds of economic laws, like antitrust laws, to govern economic transactions that take place outside what the US government claims is its territory, right, which is already colonized land. And they've justified these extensions of US law by something that they call the effects doctrine. They've said that conduct taking place outside US territorial boundaries can be subjected to US law if such conduct has effects on the US economy. So sovereigns, quasi-sovereigns, and Africans, I think, helps us think through these decisions, has helped me think through these decisions, because it insists on being attentive to the meanings of sovereignty and the implications of these meanings. And reading these US judges' sort of contemporary decisions, what's most striking to me is the way in which US judges have represented US sovereignty, not simply as kind of authority to protect a territory or authority over a physical space, but also as authority to protect a kind of contained national economy from externally originating harm. And the key move here that you can see in these decisions over and over again is kind of the judges' representations of this legal construct, a national economy, as having borders that are coterminous with the territorial boundaries of the United States. And this kind of articulation of a national economy to a national territory sort of allows sovereignty itself to come to include the protection of a national economy. And so reading these extraterritoriality decisions alongside the book is really, really interesting because it lets us see the different meanings with which sovereignty comes to be imbued in these different contexts. So the book shows us so clearly how, in the case of colonized people or post-colonial states, contracting away land becomes a manifestation of sovereignty rather than its negation. In the case of the US, in contrast, extensions of US law become logical extensions of territorial principles of jurisdiction rather than violations of those principles. So in a strange way in these decisions, you can see how the very notion of territory in the case of the United States enables what we would often think of as extraterritoriality. So the book's sort of tracing of these meanings of sovereignty allows us to do so much. Most clearly, I think it allows us to see the shortcomings of decolonization processes and the role of law in sort of creating these shortcomings. But I think in tracing these histories and meanings of sovereignty, the work also opens us possibilities for conceptualizing sovereignty and self-determination differently. And I think also conceptualizing international law and law itself differently as well. I think it shows us that while a fundamental reconceptualization of sovereignty might not actually be possible kind of within the terms of international law because of the institutional structures through which this law is interpreted, like the UN, for instance, it also sort of opens up the possibility of refusing the terms of these laws. And because I think in terms of jurisdiction, I think of this as sort of refusing the jurisdiction of international law. And the book ends here by saying, we might still save ourselves from global catastrophe if we apply self-determination and multilateralism to the future course of international relations. For me, this invocation at the end of this book of a resignified multilateralism is really, really important because it casts, I think, European international law as one lacking form of multilateralism, or as one, what Sandhya Pahuja calls one law of encounter among many. And I think in doing that, it opens up a kind of space for us to think about other both possible but also already existing laws of encounter. So I'll stop there. Thank you for the book and thank you for the symposium.
Thank you, Freya.
Thank
Our
you.
next panelist is Timothy Vasco. Timothy Vasco is Assistant Professor of Religion and Human Rights at Barnard College. His research is concerned with the relationship between theology, political philosophy, and imperialism in the history of international law. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you everyone for whose work made this panel possible. The history of law, at least in the West, has the potential to be a bit of a scandalous enterprise. In both its Christian and its post-Enlightenment variants, law claims a specific relationship to past time. On the one hand, law broadly depends very much on the knowledge of times past. Structurally, the law must preserve within itself some germinal memory of its foundational reason for being. The statue of Athena overlooking the polis, the covenant that the Israelites will not forget God's punishment of the Egyptians and his guiding them to Israel. Any modern nation state's consecration of its constitution and the events surrounding the moment self-determination was actualized. More routinely, the law relies quite regularly on various forms of precedent in order to inculcate in its subjects the perception of continuity necessary for sustaining a sense of the legitimacy of its decisions. But history is neither memory nor precedent, of course, or if the law's configuration of past times can be called history, they should be called history probably in the sense that the late Michel Rolfe-Triot defined it. That is, the memory and precedents that the law touts as its own history should be seen as records of the relations of domination that were at work in the particular place and at the particular time the record of the past event first appeared. But even in these cases, the very history that the law promotes, Triot reminds us, would exceed the law's ability to contain it by virtue of any history as history claiming to be a record of, quote, things that happened. Anytime the law makes a claim to history, then, it runs the risk of inviting scandal, because by virtue of the historical demand to record what happened, the historian might possibly dig up some record that was either willfully or unwittingly suppressed in the effort to sustain the law's claim to legitimacy and continuity. When Professor Grovogui's Sovereigns, Quasi-Sovereigns, and Africans was published in 1996, it had only been about 2 decades since scholars from the former colonies had started to raise this sense of scandal anew in Western disciplines such as anthropology, literature, philosophy, and history itself. But Professor Grovogui's main targets, international politics and international law, still for the most part remained the preserve of a cadre of apologists for for modes of Western and especially American hegemony in the international system. Sovereigns, quasi-sovereigns, and Africans productively and excitingly reintroduced a sense of scandal to international politics and law by asking 2 very simple questions. First, what do the dominant narratives of these fields claim to have happened in places where people were colonized by Western European powers, such that self-determining post-colonies came to experience degrees of failures in their sovereignty, such as Robert Jackson in his 1990 work, to which Siba was directly and devastatingly directing his book, claimed it had. Second, what had actually happened in the course of the colonial and post-colonial relationship between the quote-unquote West and Africa, such that those failures could not only take place, but indeed be said to flow from the inability of Africans and African societies, among other formerly colonized peoples, to properly govern themselves. Sovereigns, quasi-sovereigns, and Africans provided an answer to these questions that was so consequential for what counted as histories of international law and politics then, that today it seems almost painfully obvious. What had actually happened in Africa, Siba writes, was that Western Europeans had developed highly sophisticated forms of theology and science that claimed no one except Europeans were capable of properly and maturely constructing self-governing social and political orders. Any effort to do so had been and was bound to be a failure. This made it the responsibility of Western Europeans and later Americans to guide non-Europeans until such a time as they might be determined to be capable of self-governance, which was a convenient cover for forms of land theft, enslavement, and resource extraction that characterized the roughly 5-century stretch between the beginning of Western European imperialism in the 15th century and the beginning of its end in the mid-20th. The presumption that non-Europeans couldn't govern themselves justified forms of social, political, economic, and religious domination that damaged their societies so badly that failure came to be an engineered destiny, prophesied, manifested, and to be saved over and over again, 4 times on the book's count, by the very powers that had engineered the failures in the first place. If these findings are every day becoming more and more apparently correct, even in circles where this was previously unthinkable, and they are, just last year, Siba and a number of scholars on this call were asked by the notoriously hawkish periodical Foreign Policy to talk about what might be going wrong in international relations theory. We might be left wondering what else we might do with a book whose arguments now edge close to some form of common sense, other than underscore the achievement itself. I'd like to suggest that we ask what we might still be missing and what subtleties we might have overlooked in the book as we've sought to adjust our paradigms to the now painfully obvious answers that it provided. I hope Siba won't be mind if I share a little story that he once told me about this book, a product of his dissertation, while I had the privilege of being his advisee while I finished my own. He told me that when he first finished it, he sent it to a very prominent scholar, one of the few critics of mainstream international relations and law, who at the time shared his sensibilities. Several months later, the manuscript was returned with a note stating that Sovereigns, Quasi-Sovereigns, and Africans was not really a book, but more like the outline of 4 books. Where one might expect disappointment, or at least a little bafflement at this response, Siba told me that it excited him, made him feel validated. He didn't want just a book, he said. He wanted a project, a series of inquiries that he could, and indeed does continue to conduct in the years after this particular manuscript's publication. What many readers of Sovereigns, Quasi-Sovereigns, and Africans might have missed on first glance, except perhaps Professor Anghie, whose own work in 2007 carried this line of analysis forward, was in fact one of its most fundamental components. This is the book's historiographic frame that co-articulates the history of colonization in the Americas in 1492, with the opening of informal colonization and the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade in West African persons just a few decades earlier. When I say we missed this, I don't mean that it was entirely disregarded, but the research agenda and institutional reforms that this historiographic framework suggests are so profound that we're all, it seems, still working out the rudiments of how we might reconceive of and reconcile the history of international law and politics with its aspirations to represent the ambitions of particular nation states, non-state nations, and other forms of human collectivity within a broad shared framework of universal principles. Siba Gro's historiography shows us not that this ambition for the universal must be abandoned, but the manifestation of this kind of universalism that has so far been envisioned in international law and politics is largely a response to a particular set of questions that developed in early modern ecclesiastic debates and contests, economic transformations, political developments, and epistemic shifts that set into motion among Western European powers a scramble to reconceive of notions of how they were the most wise, most just, and most rational peoples on earth in the wake of the discovery of new lands and peoples and the realization of the violence that they were capable of once they had discovered these peoples. So the very serious challenge which Siba continues to pursue himself and his work continues to challenge us to pursue, the pursuit of projects outlined in Sovereigns, Quasi-Sovereigns, and Africans, but not yet completed, is this: how to tell the history of international law and politics that centers that particular problem and conceptualization of the universe without reinscribing that problem and the responses to it as universal. In this regard, I just want to make a note that Siba's work is an important entry in a long-quieted but increasingly resonant canon of sometimes brief but consequential utterances by Black scholars such as C.L.R. James, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Trio himself that sought to conceptualize the ambition of a world politics as these have been conditioned and constrained by the twin violences of genocide and colonization in the Americas and enslavement and colonization in West Africa. That violence went into the making of not only this world, but perhaps the very notion of a world and a human who inhabits it as such. What Siba Gro helpfully added to those utterances was the reminder that this world and the worlds that were said to inhabit it were products of a uniquely Christian theological vision of the universe, one that the violence and disenfranchisement of the Americas and Africa allowed Europeans to translate into claims about secular truth, order, and justice. Siba's framework is therefore a part of a long intellectual tradition that is both the condition of possibility for and essential a supplement to understanding new attempts to build new memories and histories into the law, new orientations of its relationship to past time, at least here in the Americas. Black Lives Matter protesters tearing down statues of Columbus, for example, the 1619 Project, and so forth. So the scandal that sovereigns, quasi-sovereigns, and Africans catalyzed by subjecting the law to history might itself be a condition under which any chance for the law's survival as a form of order that is perceived as legitimate by its subjects is possible at all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tim. Our next panelist is Christopher Gevers. Christopher Gevers teaches international law and legal theory in the School of Law at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. His research focuses on Black internationalism, third world approaches to international law, critical race theory, and law and literature. Since 2015, he has been a faculty member of the Institute for Global Law and Policy at the Harvard Law School, and he has held visiting fellowships at the University of Oxford and Harvard Law School. Christopher.
Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. And I want to echo Tony's sentiments about how happy I am to hear about a center who puts in its mandate not making policy recommendations. I think that saves a lot of time at the beginning of these types of things to say we offer no solutions, only critiques. So, I mean, it's bittersweet to be here. On the one hand, for the last 10 years, I've started every year reading both Siba's book and Tony's book in preparation for teaching my international law class at the university, and things are delayed because of the circumstances. And so at least now I get another January, I get to read these books again, and it's wonderful to see every time I come back to them, I see something else in them, which I think is a testament to both these books and the importance of these types of events. On the other hand, I was hoping to have Siba in person with me in South Africa during this year, and I still hope that he might be here. So Siba, you're not off the hook. You still have to come visit us sometime soon. So what I wanted to do with my two interventions is to say, in some senses, pick up on what Tony said, Lionel said, and Tim said, to try to situate Siba's work within a series of different traditions, and perhaps add one more and to pick up particularly on what Tim said at the end. So to situate this particular book within 12, so one of the first 12 pieces I think we all read, if we from within the 12 tradition, is James Gathy's review of the book. And I think Tony can speak to and Tony's own work itself speaks to some of the concerns raised within 12 by Siba. And I think there's other traditions that he touched. Lionel touched on some other traditions. But I think there's a part of Siba's book, and I want to raise a particular tradition that Siba's book touches on, a keyhole into tradition that Tim mentioned, which is the Black radical tradition. And I think it's important to if you read Siba's book, and in particular, one of his first citations is a Nigerian scholar, Umuzurike, and his book International Law and Communism in Africa, which Siba very importantly brought to my attention the first time I read Siba's book. And it's an important book because it is part of the critical tradition of international that comes out of the continent in 1979. Umuzurike's book itself is a bit of an anomaly within his own tradition of Umuzurike. Umuzurike, his criticism or his critical disposition is fleeting. It has more to do with his time at the University of Dar es Salaam in the early 1970s, where he stuck because of the Biafran War. But while he's there, he interacts with Walter Rodney. And the products of that interaction, of the radicalism that's at that university in the 1970s, is reflected in that book, International Law and Colonialism in Africa. And it's an important keyhole at the beginning of Siba's book, because in Umuzurike's book, he cites not just Eric Williams and Walter Rodney, but also Du Bois's World in Africa. And I think that tradition can be brought into conversation in many powerful ways. And the synergies are there, not just in terms of these intellectual connections that I read Siba as being a descendant of Umuzurike. Umuzurike has been a descendant of Rodney and Williams and Du Bois. But I think in the attention that Siba pays in the book to questions of race, and in particular white supremacy, and its continuation, and questions of colonialism and slavery. And I think within other traditions, and in particular, perhaps within critical traditions of international law, race has been part of the conversation, but perhaps has become more part of the conversation in recent times, thanks to the incredible work of many people, including Tendai Achume, and her report recently, and her work more generally, which is wonderful. And I encourage everyone to have a look at it. But slavery as well. Slavery is something that's not really registered, perhaps, in the critical traditions of international law in the ways that it might have. And I think Siba, as Tony mentioned, is predictive and always generative in terms of telling us where we need to go next. And I think in many ways, reading Siba within the tradition of the Black radical tradition, all the way back to Du Bois, and in particular Du Bois's Black Folk Then and Now from 1939, and before that, the work of Anna Julia Cooper, there's a line of thought that I think it's really productive and generative to read to read Siba within. It's a very vulnerable Freudian slip, Siba. It's the highest honor I paid you to call you Du Bois. But in any event, so I think that's important. And when reading the introduction to the book, I was very pleased to see that Siba mentions his time as a fellow, as I think a Du Bois Mandela Rodney fellow, and I think there's something in that as well. I think in many ways I'd want that tradition to continue in Siba's work now, which I understand to be on the critical traditions and readings of Mandela himself. So that's the first thing that I would, when I teach Siba's book, I situate him very much within the Black radical tradition as an adjunct to and parallel to critiques that come out of 12 and other Black internationalist traditions. And the second thing I wanted to point out about Siba's book, which I think is really interesting, is how Southwest Africa, so the Namibia Southwest Africa issue, has also been a very generative field of interest for the Black radical tradition. Right? So one of the very first actions of Pan-Africanists when statehood is attained in the 60s is to bring a case in the name of Liberia and Ethiopia before the International Court of Justice. And in fact, that the failure of the liberal international order, and international specifically in that case, then generates both a critical tradition and in many senses a mainstream tradition. So an unknown aspect of that is that the white settlers in Southwest Africa were so happy with the decision in that Southwest Africa case that they gave money to a fund that established the two main and ongoing, still leading international law journals in South Africa. So there's definitely a reactionary tradition that comes out of that case. But this is the thing that inspired Umuzurike. Umuzurike went to Oxford to write a PhD with Southwest Africa in mind. Unfortunately, he was there when the Biafran War broke out, and he had to then flee, I think, to Dar es Salaam, which is where his brief radicalization took place, and then he returned to Nigeria. But also Siba's book itself is inspired by, obviously, not just in content, but the idea that Southwest Africa tells us something about international law and about white supremacy and the failures of international law as not being an anomaly in the case of Southwest Africa, but as being baked into the very structure. And I think what that example does is two things. The one is to, as the Black radical tradition does, center race and white supremacy specifically as a constitutive element of international law from the 15th century right the way up to the Southwest Africa case. But I think it tells us something more about what happens afterwards. So if Southwest Africa is a generative example for international in the 90s, I think South Africa is a generative example for international today. Many of the critiques that Siba makes about international law and its failings in Southwest Africa could be made about the liberal order in South Africa and its failure to address white supremacy, its focus on political violence, its failure to address questions of land and economic injustice. So in many ways, I think the book, Siba's book is equally important today for its application to where I teach in the country currently known as South Africa, and his delineations and mapping of white supremacy have as much resonance in my work, both in international and in a domestic sense as they did when I first read it. So Siba, thank you for the book, and thank you, Melanie, for the chance to talk about it.
Thank you, Christopher. And our next panelist is Anna Agathangelou. Anna Agathangelou is professor in the Department of Politics at York University. She was a fellow in the program of Science, Technology, and Society at the School of Government, Harvard, where she developed her project titled Found in Translation, Cosmopolitics, the Value of Biotech and Racial Capitalism. Professor Agathangelou is co-editor of several books, including Time, Temporality, and Violence in International Relations, Defatalizing the Present, Forging Radical Alternatives, and Arab Revolutions and World Transformations. Professor Agathangelou is also co-author of Transforming World Politics, From Empire to Multiple Worlds. That was together with Lily Ling. And she is author of the monograph, Global Political Economy of Sex, Desire, Violence, and Insecurity in Mediterranean Nation States. Anna, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Melanie, and for everybody for making this possible. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming to have this conversation with us about Siba's work. Many know what kind of a writer Siba is. Many know what kind of a genius Siba is. Many know what kind of a political earthquake Siba is, but not too many know what kind of a friend Siba is. For almost 2 decades, Siba has been an amazing public intellectual and a friend. For many of us, we could have never become who we imagine ourselves to be today. Many of us feel that it is through, because, and in relation to Siba and his work that we are able to draw out what is best and beautiful about ourselves in conversation with each other. The time has come to speak of Siba Grovogui's thought and work, especially at this moment where we're confronted with racial subjugation and racial violence, militarization of the world, the pandemic, with leaders issuing lists of pardons and commutations to right-wing former aides and capitalist financiers, and politicians who have enriched themselves through scams, frauds, and assaults on the international in the wee hours of the end of their presidency. The time has come to speak of Siba's thought and politics if the possibilities he offers are not to be missed. And the proof of that need is given more so now among many of other signs in the recent pronouncements on the demise of the post-colonial, anti-colonial, and socialist projects whose time has come and gone, supposedly. More so, the proof is given in the arguments that the West still is and will remain the most viable project in the world. All Siba's work is guided by an anti-colonial, post-colonial impulse, and more truly planetary impulse. Beginning with his sovereign, quasi-sovereigns to his most recent work, we see that for Siba, politics as an African sensibility is not just a thought and ethos, but also a question and a demonstration of creative genius, a fashioning of revolutionary, visionary, radical possibilities. For him, the sources of these possibilities emerge out of Africa and Africans in multiple ways and are more suited to the circumstances of the people in particular regions in the world without undermining the modern ideas of democratic self-governance, without undermining the ideas of a republic. And for him, this African sensibility offers an openness which should not be foreclosed by occlusion and obliteration, or what he calls hubris and contempt. We must take Africans and African resources seriously, he tells us, and life conditions seriously, while not seeing them as simply redemptive, as this turns their understandings, their sensibilities, their struggles, their visions, their lives, their political projects into resources, and I put resources into code, into a delos or an eschatology, and this cannot be what motivates us. Siba draws extensively on African life and conditions and sources, and in a sense pointing to all of us whose desire to think about the post-colonial moment as redemptive, i.e. establishment of a state, establishment of an international law, and property relations has also to accept a sense of critically founded fear and concern from the start, a fear that is entangled with hubris and contempt. The first idea Siba tells us is the near centers in provinces of the world invested, and I quote here, the idea of civilized West, that international norms have historically proceeded by diffusion from Europe toward other provinces of the world. The second is the idea about the African sensibility or point view, which has been derided based on anthropological notions of African particularism, and therefore its inability to propose true universalisms. And instead of contending the contempt, Siba says, and I'm citing him here, he works closely and submits African sources to the test of notions like temporality, spatiality, objectivity, racial subjugation politics. In so doing, he takes on theories and contributors to ideas about the sovereign, international law, social contracts, race persistence, and the colonial projects for worlds otherwise, calling upon to acknowledge explicitly what it means and what it takes to materialize a global politics without an underside, without racial subjugation, without obliteration, without a repeatable and unspeakable remainder for the desires of the West, and I put the West in quotes here, and what Siba calls the wonderful political experiment, which, as Siba says, it has worked for them. In his prophetic book, as all my co-panelists already said, he explored two principal ways in which international law bears the imprint of the hierarchical nature of European, non-European relationships over time. Firstly, within the discursive context of European thought, and secondly, in the context of European imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism. The book is a probing analysis of the universalistic claims of international law through an examination of the structures of the discourses of both international law and politics. And I think that's Siba's very deep contribution to the way we understand not just international relations, but world politics. In the context of the Namibian decolonization. This book does intervene at different scales simultaneously in the constitution of historical, anthropological, political discourses and international law. He demonstrates how Western notions of self and sovereignty have been grounded in claims of superiority, a higher knowledge of civil institutions, and a mission to elevate the other. Ultimately, he demonstrates how all these notions are basically grounded in what he calls a narcissism. He explores the manner in which international law structures and institutions express European white supremacy and philosophic assumptions that deny, erase, or suppress non-European subjectivity. In this sense, Siba articulates a substantive and rare form of anti-colonial world politics and international legal scholarship, in addition to showing how Africans understood that they had political authority and a stake in the world during colonization, decolonization, and in the more recent configurations of world politics. In his most recent chapter in our book on time and temporality, Siba highlights how the notion of time plays a role in a more fundamental sense by deploying the production and reproduction of hierarchies and racial differentiations in the form of sovereignties and in the form of property relations and in relation to each other. In this manner, the West reformulates the world according to its existing rules and modern episteme of race and progress, of race and sovereignty, of race and property relations. In his more recent writing, Grovogui has taken social sciences and humanity and their contingent scientific enterprises to task and their entanglement with our object of study of international relations. In a careful reading of the canons, archives, events, and narratives that have defined the field, he shows systematically how Eurocentric epistemes have become justifications and not really understandings. And I think I want to highlight that difference because for Siba, this is crucial. For a self-defined ethno-class of European elites, and I cite here, who had conferred upon the globe a model of morality, normativity, and organization that imposes a territorial sovereign for itself, extraterritoriality over others by and for the West, bourgeois values, as organizing principles of the international order. That class also selected itself as, and I quote here, and I think, listen to the words, trustees of the commons and ultimate adjudicators of value only to grant itself emergency or supreme power that allows itself to be above the laws that it prescribes for all others. Drawing on his idea of serendipity, a magical happenstance, and the sort of thing that characterizes our productive human encounters, he articulates a way of working together, a model of world order before the self-identified West instituted the new world, with the European as the agent of the international and the new international order. This project of serendipity for Siba, as well as for us, brings to the fore sources that we don't even dare engage with. And he says serendipity is not a gift, and it speaks more to how important it is to have space beyond critique, to ask and engage pivotal questions. And of course, the most pivotal questions of all, I think, for Siba is, do we respect life fundamentally? If we do, and these life forms are in danger, we have to take that seriously. And he shows us how to do this by drawing extensively on visions and imaginaries and their impasses beyond the narrow, only punctuated justifications that come in the name of Western theory. Grovogui's writings ultimately come to us like a cry and supplication for different worlds, for different imaginaries, for different ethics and political architectures, ones that do not thrive on grave binaries which we inherited from theology, colonial, and imperial powers. He reanimates in a recursive manner orality in the form of stories, images, post-colonial experiences, and the connections between them to question the dominant ontologies preferred by the humanities and social sciences, and the notions of reality that they articulate for us by mobilizing crucial commonplaces of the human conditions and experiences. In conclusion, Grovogui asks us to ask ourselves about our obligations. He asks us to ask if how we live, engage, and relate to each other is the best way to be with each other, or even if how we are with ourselves is the best way to be with ourselves. His writings reorient us to mobilize those sources, those serendipity relations, as acts of improvisational artistry, as demonstrations of our inventive capacities, as a way to explore those generative possibilities for replenishing deep connections and conversations rooted in true intimacy. The planetary is a canvas. The choice is ours. Either we continue to draw and paint on it, sketches, or we know rather than making the leap to co-create something new. And I will end with some of my mother's sayings to be true with Siba's, asking of us. My mother always says, jasmine plants and lemon trees are both beautiful, both need tending and water, but they both need to be tended differently. Understanding their different quality of tending determines whether they bloom or wither. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Siba, would you like to respond before we open it up to the audience?
Yes, I mean, at minimum, I want to say thank you for all the people who took the time to be here today. I'm really humbled. And I also wanted to thank Sussex and your center for organizing this event. And I'm very, very grateful for the kind words that all the presenters have had to say about me. My mother would say, nah, he doesn't deserve any of that. But anyway, thank you very much. That I wanted to say. And besides that, I don't know. Actually, I don't know whether people, I want to let people say what they have to say. Maybe toward the end, I'll just have a 5-minute comment before it concludes. Thank you. I'll do that way, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so audience, we now have time for questions, comments. If you would like to speak, please post an X in the chat box, and then I'll call on you. And alternatively, you can also type your question or comment, and I'll read it out to the panel.
Sorry for slowing here.
Do we have a question or a comment yet? Okay, Cecilia Lynch.
I just want to say thank you to everyone. I've taught Siba's work, this particular book, in the past as well, and I just really appreciate all of the different, Anna's bringing in serendipity and everyone connecting to your own work, the theology, etc. I do want to probe Lionel a little bit. Lionel, you suggested that this has, in terms of kind of looking back, there's been a lot of discussion of how in some ways this has become common sense to a degree, but yet there is so much to do in terms of the legal forms. And in working with folks, for example, in Senegal, the ongoing oppression of kind of the French gaze on theory and on social theory, let alone law, just seems to become evident to me. And I would love for you to say a little bit more about, I think you ended with the idea of where some of this needs to go.
Thank you. Lionel, would you like to respond?
Yeah, in order to respond, I want to, I understand, but not very precisely the question.
I guess I was just, you had referred to how you looked for Siba's work, for example, and we're not able to find it in particular archives of French or French law, for example, and I guess just pick up on where you left off in your comments. If I remember correctly, and I'm sorry, I didn't take notes, so perhaps I misremembered, but I thought you had suggested ongoing paths in terms of possibly your own work, possibly what French conceptions of international law need to do with Siba's work.
Oh, yes. I can respond to that.
Great.
It's very complicated, and I think I will not have the time here, but I'm doing some archive work, and I discover, I'm not writing about this now, but I discovered that during the 1960s, the French administration was very careful about Marxist tradition or critic tradition in academy. So the politics was to hinder the possibility of those academics to be professors. And there are some I don't know how to say it in English, some circular, some kind of administrative regulation to set up this kind of politics. And also in 1968, there was a kind of movement, a social movement in Dakar, in Senegal, a movement very close to what we call in Metropolis, Mai 68, and all the leaders was dismissed of universities.
Mm-hmm.
There is a book, I think, of a colleague in United States. Maybe he will launch his book. I don't know when, but we talk about this, and there are some archives also on this subject. So I think that Siba could never wrote his book at that time in France, and until now I'm very cautious about this possibility.
Thank you. Kelly Jo Bloom.
Sorry. Hi. Thank you so much, Melanie and the panel, and yeah, for this incredible event. I want to ask, Prof, I think there's a line. I first read your book when I was an undergrad at UCT, and I remember there was a line, and I've come back to it many times since, where you say, you describe yourself as a minority in the field, and I think the context in which you say it is in relation to, forgive what is about to be inelegant paraphrasing, but the way in which you believe existing legal infrastructures are able to serve anti-colonial purposes. And I've come back to this particular line so many times because I think, you come to grad school and you're taught to be a pioneer in the field, and minority status is something to kind of stake claim to territory, but also, I guess, and I think reflecting on this at this point, 25 years on, I guess I've been wondering the extent with all the scholarship that has been inspired by that book and your subsequent work, both in terms of taking race seriously, but also kind of in imagining beyond critique in the ways in which many of the contradictions are inbuilt into the kind of logics that are being critiqued. And so much of that work that is indebted to you, and yet at the same time, some of the ways in which you describe the kind of debates, liberal humanist, post-structuralist, Marxist debates at the time, feel quite familiar when we're looking at this contemporary context. And so I wanted to ask you how you think of your work in relation to minority in the field. And also it's very difficult to work out what your field is because there are so many, but I wonder if you might reflect on that. Thanks.
Thank you. I feel more comfortable. Some people ask me a direct question, and I appreciate the question. Here's the thing. I remember one of my advisors, who is a historian of law, asking me why I like talking about minority, and I told him that minority was not even demographic for me. Minority had to do then with, and I said the field, not in the world. And the field does not define the world, though the field wishes to talk about the world. And these days I've revised that slightly, but I don't want to go into that. What I want to say is that from the time I wrote this book until today, there are this is very difficult for me to answer. Let me put it differently. 1660, the British created the British Academy. The man who proposed it proposed something to do with crown, country, and church. That's actually crown, country, and church, CCC, triple C. And imagine that all British scholars will be working, converging to support these three, the future, to preserve the future of these three institutions. And by country actually meant empire too. And for him, country, empire were the same, Francis Bacon. For as long as the field is hold to that mission, I will always be a minority in the field, which means that I actually should not be in the field as it described now. I need a different field. Mm-hmm. In that field, I will not be a minority, but since I'm obligated, compared as a scholar, to function in this other field, I will always be a minority. And I actually embrace that very strongly. I don't want to be in the mainstream. That is actually something I don't want to be in the mainstream. If I were, I would be troubled. And my grandmother would be upset. So minority, I take. That's the short answer I wanted to give. I didn't know how to answer that, but thank you for the question. Yeah.
So I just wanted to point out that Tony shared an article, and the comment says that the piece is connected to Lionel's comments about trail in Paris. Yeah. And then Lionel, did you want to respond? I see that you also left a comment.
I actually wanted to go back to Lionel's comment, if possible. Law is a language. And in that respect, law is actually universal. The language of law is not, it's particular. And every tradition has developed a particular language of law. And what I'm talking about here is the language of law in the Western traditions. And this is where Christopher was right. Umozurika is one of my precursors, and I actually do talk about him, and I'm glad you pointed that out. But here it is. Nearly everybody, I said nearly everybody, not all, but who actually was appointed, and this is where tiers-mondism or third worldism matters here, that was inserted in the judicial profession in instances of international justice. I'm going to use that loosely. Had to grapple with that, with whether law shall remain a language, the language of law, right? Law as language, I'm sorry, or whether we should all be speaking the language of law. And that has not been easy. And in fact, when somebody was talking about scandal, that's actually what I saw as a scandal first. If you look at the international, for people who are wedded to international law, I just want to use here in the International Court of Justice, Judge Tanaka, Judge Padilla, Jessup was American, he was in the New Haven legal tradition, Judge Jimenez, and etc. If you look at Namibia, the Namibia case at the United Nations, when the major changes that happen when those people either write their dissent or in the majority, but what they write actually does matter, because they're actually grappling with the idea that we should have law, right? For instance, we should have something called use quotient, which means that there are certain kinds of laws everybody should adhere to, and there's no exemption. And they agreed. The only problem was that is actually taken seriously by people who think that we should have such things. So you have the case of George Pal, the Indian who goes to Tokyo trials, and he said, why are we trying these guys in Tokyo and why not trying those people in Dresden? The rape of Nanjing, tried them up, okay. Dresden, tried those people too. But if you don't try the British, I'm not going to condemn any of the criminals in Tokyo. And he has been always misunderstood. This is what we call minority. He has always been misunderstood and characterized as this guy who who approved of what Japan did and who did not want to condemn Japanese criminals. But it's not true. He says that in plain spoken word. Is the law universal? Is war crime a war crime? Or is war crime a war crime because somebody committed it and not somebody else? Right? Does the law attach to the person? Sometimes it does. But does the materiality of the crime itself matter? Of course, he said, I will not do it. Right? He's Indian. Tanaka is Japanese. He has a complicated history of law. But when they come to Namibia, he says, right, they tell Liberia and Sierra Leone, you don't have standing. Why? Because Liberia and Ethiopia, because they were not part of the people who assigned the mandate to South Africa. And Tanaka was incensed. White people sitting in their rooms in Europe give a mandate to South Africa, and these Africans whose continent is on don't have legal standing. You must be kidding me if you think customary law matters to me here. And that was about the standing of what we call customary law. Of course, Tanaka was not saying that customary law doesn't matter. Nor did he say that parental laws don't matter, use quotient. He's not saying that we don't need law. He's simply saying, this is completely messed up. I'm sure he was thinking something that cannot be said in polite society. But that Europeans could say, we gave a mandate, and Liberia and Ethiopia, too bad. You are not there, so you don't have legal standing. Right? So the problem for all of these people I've cited, all of them from the third world, Japan included, because Japan was defeated. So in that tradition, Tanaka was, and etc. But if you can actually, it's very interesting to read all of the dissent on the International Court and see where they are coming from. We're always grappling with the idea of the language of law. Should we have laws? Right? Law as language, I'm sorry. Law as language, law as a commodity through which we transact. We have to have boundaries and limits and etc. etc. And the language of law, right? It is the same thing today about the International Court of Justice. People who say, and this is actually one of the things, I was in the Netherlands at The Hague, actually, where I blew up at somebody who was saying, Africans, they think that the court is racist. And I said, you do not understand, you actually do not understand what is implied in the African argument. Yes, a lot of scoundrels in Africa want to escape punishment by saying that the ICC is criminal and etc. Is racist, I'm sorry. But even scoundrels need to have rights. Miranda law in America, everything we appreciate about Western law has to do with laws that were there to protect scoundrels. Miranda, as in Miranda law, was on his 7th offense. Yes, African criminals have right too. But the argument against the ICC is not being made by African criminals. They are the ones people are interested in because Africa is represented by them in our newspapers, New York Times, and etc. etc. But the argument people like me make, it has nothing to do with scoundrels accepting justice. It has to do with law as language. Can we have international justice? If we do, it should be applicable to everybody. If we don't, then it's not international justice. We don't. I'll give you all of those criminals in Africa any day. But Tony Blair, Sarkozy, even Mr. Bush, at minimum ought to answer the question. At minimum. But Belgium says we cannot indict what's his name, the Israeli Prime Minister then, who had the stroke, Ariel Sharon. But we want to have the former president of Chad. It's a mockery. It's a mockery. So when people report it, it's not, the racism is not simply that they are going after these scoundrels you have, and there are many of them, obviously. The racism is that in Western humanitarian law, there has never been a time where the West is human and where the African is human. Those people who make the law, who are trustees of the planet, are always above the law. You look at the ICC, the International Court of Justice, all of the procedures, you look at Interpol, and etc. All the exemptions and the privileges and the immunities go one way, and the liabilities and the weight of whatever just inquisition, etc., go a different direction. And so what you have is that an African cannot try a European, because that's unheard of, obviously, right? But a European can try an African because that's okay. And so if you are in international law, like all those people I named today and myself, at some point you have to be incensed, because nothing we say, we are all human, obviously. Nothing we say about Africans can, right? Africans are, even in the failures, as in the genocide in Rwanda, are actually human. But the idea that Ariel Sharon cannot be asked question because why? Because he's universal. Or the Belgium says, well, we have to revisit universal jurisdiction. You tell me, and this I've asked actually somebody at the US Peace Institute. You tell me, when has this country in America, where you say we have judicial systems, the reason we have Africans at the Hague is that Europeans can judge themselves. There's not a single country that can try its war criminal in times of war. It simply is not possible. It's not that they are mean. It's not like they are warped and etc. etc. It is that when you are in the throes of war, trying yourself become politically a problem, which is why the people in My Lai got off, which is why all of the people who did those things in Iraq were pardoned. In that way, Americans are just like Africans. So yes, you cannot try your own. Africans can try their own. Send them all to the Hague. But I don't want Africans to be lining up going to the Hague and you don't send your own. If you do that, then it's not international justice. Just call it what you want. Call it what you want. But it is not international. International justice has to be universal. Law applies or does not apply. And so I get tired of hearing for Africans who say, oh, you don't, all these Africans go there. You send them there for revenge, for spite, and all the rest. I don't care. But that is not justice. Justice has to be seen to be done. Justice has to be seen to be done. And yes, the scoundrel needs justice. Miranda was on his 7th offense, but Miranda had the right to a lawyer. That's why we have Miranda law. And so that is actually, and so these questions of justice actually, and so when somebody said earlier in one of the comments that the scandal of international law, I actually wrote this because I was scandalized. I was scandalized by two things about Namibia. I really wrote it because I was scandalized. And then it became a project. I may as well just make those comments now and stop. I was scandalized because when I started writing my proposal, there was something in Geneva called the pre-implementation talk. This is the thing. The International Court of Justice tells South Africa, you no longer have the mandate, it's under UN tutelage. And then they have all these things that they have to do for independence in Namibia. And then there was an implementation talk in Geneva, to go to Geneva and have implementation. And the Americans said, no. Before we have implementation, we should have pre-implementation talks. The pre-implementation talks, right? The pre-implementation talks were really about two things. A, to protect the whites in South Africa. If you don't believe me, read the book by Bill Clinton's national security advisor. It's called The Tar Baby Option. The Tar Baby Option, he doesn't quite say it, but it actually is about race. Read Antony Lake. That was British, that was American foreign policy. It was the guy who became Bill Clinton's national security advisor called it the Tar Baby Option. That was a liberal way of saying, well, we made a mistake here. But it's not a mistake. The whole thing was about race. But what Antony Lake said implicitly was that Henry Kissinger basically said that there was nothing important about Black people's lives that should subvert US national security interests. That's what Antony Lake is denouncing in the Tar Baby Option. And people who are defending Henry Kissinger today sounded to me very much like a lot of the talks I hear today about securitization. Right? It sounded to me like that, which is why I prefer just war theory to all of this security study analysis. You know, we can sit here and watch, as the Roman did in the Colosseum, the slave be thrown at lions, and watch it in the interest of good athleticism. The slave is strong, the fighting, etc. The lion has prowesses, and etc., etc. And forget that the slave is being served as dinner to the lion. I take the sportsmanship anytime over the athletic prowesses. The sport is not about, it's about athleticism, of course, but it's about sportsmanship. So you can enjoy that game, I will not enjoy it. We can't be right about people's justification as to why they are doing something and forget what they are doing. International relations is about morality, it's about order. It's not about indulgence or humoring somebody or trying to justify or to see why somebody might think this dimension of this construction might be interesting, this whatever might be interesting. Of course, that's what Henry Kissinger did. That was a Tar Baby Option. You know, we feel. That is why actually I'm drawn to international law. International law is not about how you feel, it's not how you represent, it's about materiality. Fear is not the same as threat in law. Fear is racism. Threat is what actually people do. And so we can make securitization, blah, 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 all the fear that goes into whatever people do. That is actually where the racism is. That's what Antony Lake called what Kissinger did, the Tar Baby Option. It was about race. We should not humor people who want to talk about security in terms of national security, blah, 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 all of that stuff, or how people construct their fear. If it's fear, call it for what it is racism. Right? And I just speak about this in passion because at the time I was so incensed. We know everything we need to do in Namibia, but we have pre-implementation. And pre-implementation means that we have to go first and say what property means, what security means, whatever, so we can all agree indoors in enclosed somewhere there and agree on what we are going to talk about publicly, and then we can go to the implementation. Ce n'est pas sérieux. It's not simply that ce n'est pas sérieux. It is really, that's what it is. We should not indulge that. Nobody should indulge anybody saying, oh, you know, we should not indulge people in their fears. The Black is not a threat, not even as an immigrant. The Muslim is not a threat. The Jew is not a threat. Nobody is a threat. We judge everybody by what they do. That's why I like law. I prefer to discuss, and the reason I like just law theory is that you cannot talk about law, you have to adjudicate, so you have to take position, which is why I don't, all these securitizations, I don't do, because you can't take position. While I'm just talking about. Talk about that until tomorrow. I actually want to know where you stand. And that was my problem with Henry Kissinger. If you see the date, that book, I started my proposal when the pre-implementation talks were going. And the other part was obviously about the law, about sovereignty, right? So if you cannot be scandalized about the condition of the world today, there's actually a problem. There is a problem. We should not individualize it, but we should particularize the problem, right? And just one last point. When I wrote this book, I made sure to say that when I talk about the West, I'm being very particular to recognize the official West and to recognize that the levelers and the diggers and the Irish and etc. were treated almost as poorly as the blacks. So the West is not everybody who lives in Europe. It's not everybody who lives in the West. It's not whatever. I don't need to exculpate anybody, but we actually have to be agile in how we understand the world, right? And so Cromwell started in Ireland. That's all I can say. And so I don't know that the Irish should be blamed for what the British did. I'll stop there but somebody triggered something in me about Namibia and the law. I just have to say that it's very difficult as a lawyer to be in those halls at The Hague or anywhere else and to not have to fight people thinking that their own language of the law, right, is law as language. Law as language, you can agree on that without buy into the language of law of anybody. Because what we have today is not international law. It acts as international law in lieu of it, of what we ought to have, but it's not. And in that, I remain a minority, like all the people I cited earlier, from Tanaka to everybody. You have to. Shalom, I stop there. Yeah.
Would someone like to respond? And I also wanted to thank everybody who's been sharing resources in the chat function.
Melanie, can I say something there, just I guess as the person designated as international law? I mean, also I think what's so generative about the 1966 decision is, as Siba points out, it's a question of the structure of the international order, but there's very practical things that are happening to engineer that decision at an interpersonal level. And I think it's important to hold on to those to capture kind of the intricacy of white supremacy. So Victor Catan, I put the piece up in the chat, has written about the engineering that's happening behind the scenes, the collaboration between the Australian judge and the British judge to disqualify the Pakistani judge, so that between the 1962 and the 1966 decision, there's a change, and that eventually means that the 1962 decision becomes the majority in 1966. Yeah. That's just rank engineering. That's just absolutely behind the scenes. There's Victor's done wonderful work on this. And so while, of course, this is happening at a structural level, there are very mechanical operations happening. And the only way that Judge Percy Spence, the Australian, the South African, the British, and the European know they can do that is because they share a connection of transnational whiteness, which allows them to conspire. And we don't know that because the archive is since buried. Ernest Gross, who's the one who convinces Liberia and Ethiopia to bring the case, was a diplomat for America for a very long time. He was a representative to the UN in the Korean War. He was an anti-communist, and he became the representative of the African states. He went to newly independent African states in 1960 and said, you should bring this case, you'll win. And of course, he didn't win. And then the South Africans, when the South Africans won the case, surprisingly in 1966, they not only raised some money to fund the South African Yearbook of International Law, which, as I say, continues to this day, never acknowledged its origins in that decision. But the South Africans then publish a book basically publish their memorials to say, look, we won, here's a book. They call it very unsexy title, Ethiopia versus Liberia. But if you read that book is essentially modern critical international law. It's all about indeterminacy. It's all about how the South Africans can show that the Liberians can't prove their case on the facts and they can't prove their case on the law. It's all about apology and utopia. And what I love about Siba's book is he makes a very clear point that to say international law is indeterminate is not just the same as saying it doesn't work in very determined ways. It's irrational, but it's an authoritative discourse because of its materiality, because of its relationship to white supremacy and history and world making. And I think reading the tradition of critical international law, as in some senses just the follow-on of the apartheid government's argument, paints the kind of radical indeterminacy that we've seen in the discipline in a very different light. So I think they're both between the discourses and the very practical questions. The 1966 decision is fascinating. And also because if you go to the General Assembly and read the reaction to the 1960s decision, it's all the same stuff that comes with the ICC. It's saying this is illegitimate, we're going to withdraw from the court, we're going to defund the court, we're going to establish our own court. It's the same conversation that happens in 2009 with an international institution. And I would say the difference between the two, perhaps if I was to be provocative and non-patriotic, is that South Africa comes in the 90s and is very committed to the liberal international order and drags Africa back to another institution to face essentially the same type of injustice it experienced in 1966. And I think here's when perhaps Siba and I might disagree on the role of Mandela in dragging African states back to the court in the 1990s. So what I wanted to do is just quickly to ask Siba a question.
Before you ask your question, I want to interject. I said that for me, Mandela, my position on Mandela is American position on king. Kings for American men have died in 1963. Mandela is Rivonia. After Rivonia, Mandela is a different entity. So let's just say that.
Perfectly.
Ask your question.
So my question actually taps into that. So it's to ask Siba, because I need to put it in my diary for 25 years from now. What are you working on currently? Can you speak to us a little bit about your work on Mandela and the history, sort of the alternative history linking back, as I understand it, to the Haitian Revolution and Colombo's and before? Yeah. Can you give us a taster of our next meeting in 25 years?
Yeah. Actually, thank you, and I'm sure I'm going to take the whole time. I'm working on two manuscripts. The first is The Gaze of Copernicus, which is what Anna was quoting from toward the end about serendipity. And yes, it begins in Serendipo, which is Sri Lanka, the Golden Island. That's where it starts. It's called The Gaze of Copernicus, Postcolonialism, Serendipity, and the Making of the World. But I'm writing that so that I can write the book that I really want to write, which is No Partial Public Sympathies. That's not the final title. Tim doesn't know that yet. But it's about, again, when I was talking about the language of law, people have indulged themselves so much in thinking that international law, especially human rights, begins somewhere in Europe and then goes to Africa, etc. And these two began with a scandal, right? When somebody told me in Africa, the civil and political right, humanitarian law begin in Europe, it actually did not escape me to ask them, between the slave and the slave owner, who would have been the first to say, "You shall never beat me, sir"? It turns out that the Quilombolas in Brazil were the first to actually prohibit the use of torture. At the time when Francis Bacon, the father of Western science, was commissioner of torture. Yes, that was his title. He was commissioner of torture when Quilombolas in Brazil were outlawing torture. And I decided I have to write about a particular tradition which exists in African political thought about law and the human in law, beginning with Quilombola until Rivonia, which is what I was saying, right? And what you have is that whether it's them, the Haitians, Frederick Douglass here in America defending the right of Chinese immigrants, whether it's Amilcar Cabral about our fight is against colonialism, not even the colonizer, because at the end of colonialism, the colonizer becomes citizen. There is a sense of self-abnegation as foundation of morality and law that exists in African traditions, that exists nowhere in the modern world, consistently. And I want to write about those traditions of law, thinking about law, relating to law that pertains to the human. How do we see other people? And again, the motivation are two. Africans who think that anybody who talks about African dictators, sorry, not all Africans, African dictators who think that anybody who talks about human rights is mimicking Europeans' nonsense. And Europeans who think that they actually own this stuff. Because they don't. And when they do, their versions of them are very, very lukewarm and interesting, because it's conceived in the context of empire for European hegemony, and so it comes with all these caveats and constitutional defect. In the purest form, the commitment to life and to equality. If you want to look at it, you don't look for the colorful butterflies who flow around the land and etc. You look for the black butterfly sitting quietly in the forest who sees all. The black butterfly at the end of the day has the truth. The black butterfly. Not the colorful one who go again claiming everything in the forest from this leaf, that leaf, etc. Is the black butterfly. It's the one that is sitting quietly, who sees everything. Those are the people who imagine the quilombolas that they cannot have an order in Latin America to which anybody could be excluded on the basis of religion, of color, of identity. Native Americans, the Dutch around them, everybody was citizen. The first Republican form in the New World was not America, it was Palmares. And that's also part of this book. And the book opens with the Dutch and Zumbi, the Quilombo. Abjuration. When the Dutch said we no longer recognize the authority of the Spaniard, we took that to be their independence, because human beings are trusted on the basis of what they say. When the Americans said it, we said Declaration of Independence. When the Quilombo said it, we say rebellious slaves. Because even abjuration doesn't work the same way for Black people as it does for white. Abjuration against order, proper order in the church, requires punishment. So the Blacks are still being punished for saying we declare ourselves to be free, even though the entity they created lived longer than the Soviet Union. Wikipedia still calls it a rebellious slave colony. How can they be rebellious? They created a state, they had they had a republic in effect, and etc. And I actually begin 5 years apart. William the Silent, his apologia, and then followed by abjuration. And what happened in the Quilombo? We are still in the episteme of the fugitive slave law. When the slaves get free, we take them back to the plantation. We refuse to accept that these Black people were ever free. They shall ever be fugitive slaves, not because of what actually happened, but because we as white people say so. Yeah. Palmares was the first republic in the New World, and that's actually where the book begins. I begin with a quarrel. No, not only was it the first the first republic in the free world, in the New World, I'm sorry, not because it was the first republic in the New World, but because also it started a tradition that is far more powerful in law than the Americans ever could imagine, possibly. They do not have to have a Louisiana Compromise, a Missouri Compromise, I don't know, Connecticut Compromise, and all the rest. They took all humans to be equal, no matter their religion, no matter their color, no matter their gender. Yes, gender. And from Quilombolas, every major Black person in the radical thought that Chris was talking about has actually gone in that direction. Fred Douglass was with the women whatever, Seneca. So was Du Bois. He actually defended the right of Chinese to be American in the whatever he called it, citizenship. What was the title of the book, the speech in Boston? I'm now forgetting. I know the speech was in Boston. Everybody. It does not matter that that the black butterfly never made its nest, that other people preyed on it, that Republic never saw the day. But it matters that the ideas are there. It did not flourish because of the incoherency or the weakness in the idea. It did not come about for other reasons. We have to accept that, because 2 millennia after, and plus after the Platos and etc., we actually found that the ideas have pertinence to life. And maybe one of these days, those ideas also should matter to us. But they do. And they are far more interesting. Legal thought, legal traditions, in those traditions, than we have yet, whatever. So, Christopher, that's what I want to write about, because I do not just want to criticize what the Europeans did. I actually wanted to give the alternative, which is what Team Vasco said, that I said that I had a project. I had a project. The project, there has to be a space beyond critique. And that's the space I'm looking for now, a space beyond critique, because they are alternative, and I want to build it coherently so that nobody thinks that it's just, your perspective on this. It's not a perspective, it's a different tradition. And yes, Black Butterfly is not in the title, but it will appear on the cover. I stop.
So you just stole my joke, Siba. That's what was going to be my contribution.
To what?
About the cover and the black butterfly. But I'm happy we agree.
We agree that there will be a black butterfly on the cover, yes.
Any other questions or comments? We have a few more minutes.
I have 26 siblings. You can call me you are a fool. I accept that too. But you have to say something.
I'm going to ask a question. So, Siba, how do you see, let's see, I mean, how do you see I don't like the word refusal, but in a way, I mean, I understand your work, but also how do you see that work really rupturing in a way, the ways that humanism has been made to fit a white vision of the world and of any possible world to come? How do we, I mean, not only bringing those resources as you are saying, but how do you really do this in a sustainable way, that really ruptures, that kind of, orientation. And I think Tim brought that up a lot around, going back to the sources, but also at the same time, elevating the sources to the level that really does not allow any longer for these ongoing reproductions.
This I will say, and I actually mean it. I think American universities are very creative and very nimble, that they will never allow what happened to the Jesuits to happen to them. What happened to the Jesuits is that in the 1960s, they were standing on street corners in Africa and Latin America and everywhere else, reading the Bible in Latin, and nobody will pay attention to them. And so they had to have Vatican II and agree to translate the Bible in all those other languages so people can actually read them. I think that more and more young people in America and the universities are going to realize that, in fact, what they have taught, their canons are very limited. With all respect to Martha Nussbaum, when people start realizing that there actually is a Dar es Salaam, this is not some cosmopolitan idea abstract somewhere there, that Arabs came to Tanzania somewhere and it's called Dar es Salaam. They had this composite language, composite nation. They had all of these things, that there is actually a cosmopolitan project on the African coast called Dar es Salaam is an actual cosmopolitan project, is a thing. Then they realized we don't have to sit in Chicago, wonderful place, University of Chicago, great institution, etc., etc. Imagine possibilities where you actually have a real human project or cosmopolitan project supported by ideas, African, Islamic, non-Islamic, secular, non-secular, and etc., etc. There is Dar es Salaam. Why do I cosmopolis in the Greeks and etc., etc.? Leave Chicago a bit. Chicago is comfortable. Travel, you might actually see it. Go to Dar es Salaam. Those same young American students will realize that when Kant was writing all of manners of stuff, there's somebody in Africa, in Timbuktu, who was only 5 years younger than Kant, Al-Kunti, who was writing about the same problematic, because the world was going through this economic transformation, regionalism, and etc., commercial societies. It was a worldwide phenomenon, and he was writing about it in a far more interesting way than Kant. I'm sorry, Kant never left Königsberg. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with imaginary. I'm a scholar, so nothing wrong about imagining. But sometimes it has to correspond to material reality. That is not given. And I'm sorry for Kant. Not leaving Königsberg actually was slightly tied him down a bit. Yeah. And when we travel, the way we see the world also differs. There is a difference between Ibn Battuta, Marco Polo, Christopher Columbus, and Zheng Yi, the Chinese. We bring stuff of us, which is why I like my story about the 3 principles of Serendipity, which is what the first book is about. We see the world differently, we relate to the world differently. We just have to stop thinking that the paradoxes we face, the conflict that we have, the dilemmas that we have are universal. No, the dilemmas, paradoxes, and etc. arise from particular contexts. And if you cannot transcend yours, look somewhere else. And there is always a somewhere else. And we just stop this foolishness. And I say that absolute sincerity that those scholars, you can see it in the UK already, you can see it in Australia, you see it in America, they'll quickly start to say, well, you know, Frank Kant said this, but there's a guy there called Akunti. And then we'll begin to have a different kind of conversation. American universities are not as rigid as the Catholic Church. I'm Catholic, by the way, I can say that. So what happened to what happened to the judge will not happen to them. No, but we have to, and the world is changing. Europe no longer thinks the world alone. There's a fellow called Antony Anghie. There's a fellow called Christopher. There's my nephew's mother, Agathangelou, right? No relationship with her, but I'm her children's uncle. But the world is changing, it's going to change. I never leave my French books too far behind, but what's his name? Help me. No army can stop an idea whose time has arrived. Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo was right about that one, right? And so was Stanley. You see, we actually should take these colonial entrepreneurs seriously. Henry Morton Stanley liked his booze. And one day in one of his drunken moments in Africa, stopped and told his interlocutors, said, you know, we have a problem. And the problem was that if they don't teach the natives, they cannot justify colonialism. But he said, in one of those insights, in a drunken moment, he said, but I dread to think what they'll write about us once we teach them how to write. And that moment is coming very, very soon. And that's where I stopped. That's where I have to stop. Thank you very much, you all. And I give it to Melanie to close. Thank you very much. I'm really honored. I'm very humble. And I'm sorry when I get excited, I try to raise my voice. And so if your ear was buzzing, I'm sorry. But I'm glad you all came. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been such a nourishing panel and symposium. We're very grateful, Siba, for your work. Well, I'm also very grateful for the panelists, for everybody for coming together, for finding a common time to get together to have these important conversations, you know, in the time also of a pandemic. I want to recognize that and the larger political context. So thank you, everybody, you know, for bringing yourselves to this conversation, and thank you to the audience, and everybody have a lovely afternoon, late night, Tony in Singapore. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.